The child's scream cut through the air like a knife through flesh, and Justin knew that if he kept running, he would survive the night. But he himself would never survive. The three blue wolves circling the sapphire-skinned girl were sacred beasts. Killing them meant death, but walking away meant something worse than death. In that moment, covered in mud and blood, branded as a slave, and hunted like an animal, he made the choice. The rain had not stopped for 3 days. It hammered against the alien forest with a violence that made every leaf a drum, every branch a gong, every hollow in the massive trees a resonating chamber for nature's fury. The water was not clear like earth rain, not the gentle precipitation that nourished fields and filled streams with life-giving freshness. This water carried minerals that left rusty streaks on everything it touched, staining the blue-furred moss that covered the massive trees, turning the ground into a treacherous slick of mud and decomposing vegetation that smelled of rot and something else, something sharp and metallic that Justin could not identify even after 2 years on this cursed planet. Justin ran with the desperation of a man who knows that stopping means death. His lungs burned with each breath, pulling in the thick, humid air that never seemed to carry enough oxygen. His legs screamed for rest, the muscles in his calves and thighs cramping and spasming with every pounding step. But he could not stop, would not stop, because behind him somewhere in that endless maze of twisted trunks and hanging vines dripping with phosphorescent slime, they were hunting. He could still hear the hunting horns, distant but persistent, like the baying of hounds that would never tire, never give up, never stop until they had dragged him back to the mines or left his corpse for the scavengers. His feet splashed through puddles that hid roots and rocks, nearly sending him sprawling with every other step. The gravity here was heavier than Earth's, not by much, perhaps 15% more, but enough that every movement required more effort, more energy that his starving body did not have to give. It was like running with weights strapped to every limb, like trying to sprint through water. His prison uniform, little more than a rough gray cloth woven from some local fiber that chafed and irritated the skin, hung in tatters from his frame. Underneath, his body told the story of his captivity and scars. The brand on his shoulder, burned deep into the muscle with a red-hot iron in a ceremony designed to break the spirit as much as mark the flesh, marked him as property of the overseer. His wrists bore the purple-black bruises and raw wounds from the chains he had worn for the better part of 2 years, heavy iron manacles that had rubbed his skin away to expose the tendons beneath. 2 years. It felt like a lifetime, like the man he had been before was someone else entirely, someone from a dream or a story he had once heard. Justin barely remembered the man he had been before the abduction, before the slave ship with its cramped holds and diseased prisoners, before this world with its blue skies and 3 moons and cruel masters who looked at humans the way humans looked at cattle. That man had been soft, comfortable, ordinary, an accountant living in a suburb, driving the same route to work every day, complaining about traffic and taxes and the weather. This man, the one who ran through alien rain with stolen tools and murder on his hands and nothing but survival in his heart, was something else entirely. This man was a weapon forged in suffering, honed by necessity, tempered by loss. He slowed for just a moment, pressing against the trunk of a massive tree whose bark secreted a thick amber sap that supposedly had medicinal properties but mostly just stuck to everything it touched. His hands trembled violently as he cupped them beneath a stream of water flowing down the ridged bark. The water tasted foul, metallic, and bitter with dissolved minerals, but he drank anyway, gulping it down despite his stomach's protests. His body convulsed, trying to reject the alien water, but he forced it down through sheer willpower. Water was water, and on this planet, beggars could not afford to be choosers. A sound cut through the rain, different from the horns, different from the constant patter of water on leaves, higher pitched, more urgent. A child's scream, raw with terror and pain, the kind of sound that bypassed rational thought and struck directly at something primal in the human brain. Justin froze, every muscle tensing, his body going completely still in the way that prey animals freeze when a predator draws near. His rational mind, the survivor's instinct that had kept him alive through beatings and starvation and the brutal work in the mines where men died every day from cave-ins or exhaustion or simply giving up, told him to keep running. A child's scream meant danger. It meant pursuers nearby, perhaps already setting a trap. It meant certain death if he investigated, because the only children on this planet belonged to the masters, and protecting their young was worth any cost. But his hand was already moving, pulling the mining axe from his belt, even as his mind screamed at him to run, to save himself, to think of his own survival. The tool was not meant for combat. It had been designed for breaking rocks in the deep shafts where the masters sent their human slaves to dig for precious ores. Its handle was too short for proper leverage in a fight, its blade pitted with rust and chips from cutting through countless tons of stone. But it had weight, substantial weight, and weight could kill if applied with enough force and determination. He moved through the undergrowth, pushing aside fern fronds the size of doors, their surfaces covered in tiny hooks that caught on clothing and skin. The screaming grew louder, more desperate, and with each step closer, Justin felt something inside him breaking and reforming. The screaming stopped being just noise and became the voice of someone specific, someone terrified, someone dying. It became human, even though the child making those sounds was anything but. The screaming was punctuated now by a sound that made his blood run cold despite the warmth of exertion. Laughter, but not human laughter, not anything close to the sound of joy or amusement. This was something between a cackle and a clicking, like bones rattling in a box, like stones grinding together, like something fundamentally wrong with the universe expressing itself through sound. Justin parted the last curtain of hanging moss, the bioluminescent strands sticking to his arms and leaving glowing traces on his skin, and saw the clearing. What he saw made his heart clench in his chest, made his breath catch, made time seem to slow down. The girl sat at the base of a tree, her hands covering her face, body curled into as small a ball as physically possible. Her skin was the deep blue of sapphires, almost glowing in the dim light that filtered through the canopy, marked with the subtle patterns that indicated high birth among her people. She could not have been more than 5 years old, small even for her kind, dressed in fine cloth that marked her as nobility, expensive fabric woven with metallic threads that caught the light, now torn and muddy, but still recognizable as the garments of the wealthy. Around her, circling with predatory patience and that horrible clicking laughter, were 3 blue wolves. The beast moved with the casual confidence of predators who knew their prey was trapped, who were in no hurry because the outcome was already decided. They were playing with her, enjoying her terror, drawing out the moment before the kill. Justin had seen these creatures from a distance during his time in the mines. The guards used them to track escaped slaves, setting them loose with a piece of clothing to give them the scent, watching with amusement as the beasts ran down their prey. They were not wolves, not really. The name was just what the human prisoners called them because of their general shape and hunting behavior. They were larger than earth wolves, much larger, more muscular, with a double row of teeth in their jaws that could crush bone like dry wood. Their bodies were covered in what looked like blue fur from a distance, but up close it was clear that the fur was interspersed with bony plates that formed a kind of natural armor along their spines and shoulders. Plates that could turn a knife blade or deflect a glancing blow. The largest of the 3, a monster that must have weighed close to 300 pounds, with shoulders as high as Justin's waist, opened its jaws and made that clicking laugh again. The sound seemed designed by evolution to trigger primal fear in any creature that heard it. It was working. The girl trembled violently, her whole body shaking, small sounds of terror escaping from behind her hands. She was making a high-pitched keening sound, the kind of noise that came from a throat too constricted by fear to form actual words. The girl, Gloria Lee was her name, though Justin did not know it yet, peeked through her fingers at the beast. Her eyes were wide, golden like coins catching sunlight, filled with a terror so pure and absolute it hurt to look at. She knew she was going to die. She knew these creatures would tear her apart, and her young mind could not process that knowledge, could not accept it, could only fill with an overwhelming dread that paralyzed her completely. Tears streamed down her blue cheeks, mixing with the dirt and making muddy tracks. Her lips moved, forming words that might have been prayers or pleas, or simply the names of her parents. But no sound came out except that terrible keening. Justin's mind raced through options with the speed born of 2 years, learning to make split-second decisions in life or death situations. The path to his left was clear, unobstructed, leading deeper into the forest where he could lose himself in the maze of trees and vines. He could slip away right now. These were not his people. This was not his fight. The girl's people had enslaved him, dragged him across the stars in chains, worked him until his hands bled and his back broke. He remembered the auction where he had been sold, standing naked on a platform while buyers examined him like livestock, checking his teeth, his muscles, prodding him with sticks. He remembered the first beating he had received for moving too slowly, the overseer's whip cutting lines of fire across his back. He remembered watching his friend Marcus die in the mines, crushed when a tunnel collapsed, and how the guards had simply left the body there, telling the other slaves to work around it. He remembered all of this in a fraction of a second, every humiliation, every injury, every moment of despair. He owed them nothing, less than nothing. They owed him 2 years of his life, 2 years of suffering, 2 years of watching friends die in the mines or at the end of a whip. Walking away would be justice in a way, leaving this child to the fate that her people had condemned so many humans to. Balance, karma, whatever you wanted to call it. His feet moved him toward the clearing anyway, making the choice before his conscious mind had finished deliberating. He thought for just a moment of Anna, his daughter. 7 years old when he had been taken from Earth, probably 9 now if she was still alive, if the cancer had not taken her in his absence. The last time he had seen her was through a video call from his hotel room, her face on the small screen telling him about her day at school, about the drawings she had made, about how much she missed him. She had asked when he was coming home, and he had promised it would be soon, just a few more days. That was the last conversation they had ever had before the abduction in the parking garage. She had the same wide eyes when she was scared, the same way of trying to make herself smaller when the world became too big and too frightening. The same helpless vulnerability that made his chest ache with the need to protect. He had not been there when she needed him most. The cancer diagnosis had come 3 months after his abduction. He knew this because he had overheard guards talking about the news broadcasts back on Earth, about the missing people, about the families left behind. He did not know if Anna had survived her treatment, did not know if she had spent her last days asking for her father, wondering why he had abandoned her. The image of Anna decided him, as it always did when he was faced with moral choices in this nightmare world. He could not save his own daughter, but he could save this one. He could do one good thing in a universe that seemed designed to crush goodness. He could be human, truly human, in a way that had nothing to do with species and everything to do with choice. Justin burst from the undergrowth with a roar that was barely human, more animal than man, raw fury given voice and projected with every ounce of air in his lungs. The sound was calculated, meant to confuse the wolves, to make them pause and reassess the situation, to trigger their own survival instincts that said unknown threats should be treated with caution. But it was also genuine, the release of 2 years of pent-up rage and grief and helplessness. It was the sound of a man who had finally found something worth fighting for, something worth dying for. It worked. For half a second, all 3 predators turned their attention from the easy prey to this new threat, their heads swiveling in unison, their clicking laughter stopping abruptly. In their eyes, Justin saw the calculation happening. This new creature was larger than the child, clearly aggressive, clearly willing to fight. Was it worth the risk? That half second was all Justin needed to close the distance. He crashed into the nearest wolf, using his shoulder like a battering ram, putting his full weight and momentum behind the impact. The collision was brutal, the shock of it traveling through his entire body. The wolf was not expecting such aggression from prey, and the impact sent both of them sprawling into the mud. Justin felt something crack in the wolf's ribcage, heard the distinct sound of breaking bone, felt the animal's breath whoosh out in a surprised grunt. The wolf recovered faster than he did, its predator's reflexes and four-legged stance giving it better balance. But Justin had momentum and surprise, and 2 years of anger fueling his movements. He brought the axe down in a brutal overhead swing before the wolf could fully regain its footing. The blade caught the wolf in the skull with a wet crunch that reverberated up Justin's arms, the shock of impact traveling through his bones and into his teeth. The wolf spasmed once, its legs kicking in a final reflex that sent mud flying and went still. Blood, blue-tinged and viscous, spread in a pool around the shattered skull, steaming slightly in the cool air. The second wolf attacked from the side, jaws snapping, moving with terrifying speed that blurred its form. Justin tried to jerk the axe free, but it was stuck fast in the first wolf's skull, the blade wedged between bone plates. He abandoned it, throwing himself backward as teeth closed on empty air where his throat had been a moment before. He hit the ground hard, mud spraying, the impact driving the air from his lungs. He rolled instinctively, operating on pure survival instinct, and the wolf's second attack missed by inches, jaws snapping shut with an audible click. The wolf came at him again, and this time there was no dodging. Jaws clamped down on his forearm with crushing force, teeth punching through skin and muscle, grinding against bone. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, white-hot agony that shot up his arm and exploded in his brain like a supernova. Justin's vision went white for a moment, his body trying to shut down, to escape the pain through unconsciousness. But unconsciousness meant death. Death for him and death for the child. That thought cut through the pain like a blade through fog. Justin did not scream, though every nerve in his body begged him to. Screaming was a waste of air, a waste of energy, a sign of weakness that predators responded to. Instead, he drove his thumb into the wolf's eye, pushing deeper even as the creature thrashed and bit harder, trying to tear his arm off. He felt the eye pop under pressure, felt warm fluid gush over his hand, thick and viscous like egg yolk. The wolf's grip loosened, just slightly, just enough. Justin ripped his arm free, leaving behind strips of flesh caught on the wolf's teeth, and grabbed a rock the size of his fist. The torn flesh hung in ribbons, exposing muscle and tendon beneath, blood flowing freely. The pain was so intense he could taste it, a metallic tang that filled his mouth. But pain meant he was alive, meant he could still fight. As the wolf recoiled, momentarily blinded and confused by the pain in its ruined eye, he smashed the rock into its snout. Once. The cartilage crunched under the impact. Twice. Blood and mucus flew from the ruined nose, splattering his face and chest. 3 times. The bone beneath the flesh gave way with a sickening crack. The wolf whimpered, a sound almost pitiable, so human in its pain that for a moment Justin felt a flash of guilt. Then he remembered the child, remembered the slaves he had seen torn apart by these beasts, and he hit it again. The wolf backed away, shaking its head violently, spraying blood in wide arcs that painted the surrounding ferns crimson. It whimpered again, a broken sound, and limped away a few steps, clearly reconsidering the cost of this meal. The third wolf, the big one they would later call Vulu in the legends told by Gloriale's people, hit Justin like a freight, trained before he could even register its approach. 300 pounds of muscle and fury slammed into him, driving him flat on his back into the mud with such force that all the air exploded from his lungs. His head bounced off a rock beneath the mud, sending stars spinning across his vision. For a terrible moment, he thought his skull had cracked. The jaws opened wide above him, revealing that double row of teeth designed to hold struggling prey, dripping blue saliva that burned where it touched his skin, leaving angry red welts. The stench of the creature's breath was overwhelming, like rotting meat and sulfur, like death itself leaning down to claim him. This close, he could see everything with horrible clarity. The individual teeth stained with old blood, the pink tissue of the gums, the throat muscles contracting as the wolf prepared to bite down and tear his face off. This was it. This was how he died. Alone on an alien world, torn apart by an animal, his body left to rot in the mud. Anna would never know what happened to him. No one would. He would just disappear, Another missing person, another unsolved mystery. But even as these thoughts flashed through his mind, even as he felt the hot breath on his face, his hand was scrabbling in the mud, his fingers desperately searching for anything, any weapon at all. They closed on another rock, this one jagged and sharp, a fragment of volcanic glass with edges that cut into his palm even as he gripped it. As the jaws descended toward his face, he drove the rock upward with all his remaining strength, all his rage, all his refusal to die without fighting. It caught the wolf in the soft palate, the vulnerable flesh of the mouth's roof, tearing through tissue. The wolf's roar became a gurgle as blood filled its throat. Justin hit it again, this time in the side of the head, targeting the temple where the skull was thinnest. The impact sent vibrations through the rock and into his hand. Again, the skull fractured with a sound like breaking pottery. Again. The wolf's eyes rolled back, showing white, and it collapsed on top of him. Dead weight that crushed the air from his lungs and pinned him to the ground. For a long moment, Justin lay there, unable to move, unable to breathe, pinned beneath the corpse. His vision swam, black spots dancing at the edges, multiplying, threatening to consume his entire field of view. His chest screamed for air, but could not expand under the weight. 300 pounds of dead wolf pressed down on him like a tombstone. Panic began to set in, the primal terror of suffocation, the most basic fear that no amount of courage can fully overcome. His hands clawed at the mud, trying to find purchase, trying to push the corpse off. But the wolf was too heavy, the mud too slippery, his remaining strength too depleted. He was going to suffocate here, having won the fight but dying anyway, crushed beneath his victory. Then small hands grabbed his arm, pulling with all their strength. Gloriali, the child he had saved, was trying to help him, her face contorted with effort. She could not possibly move the wolf, could barely move Justin's arm, but her effort gave him something to brace against. He pushed with everything he had left, feeling something tear in his shoulder, and managed to wriggle an inch to the side, then another inch. Then enough that he could draw a gasping breath, sweet air flooding his lungs. With her continued pulling and his desperate pushing, he managed to slide out from under the corpse, emerging muddy and bloody and gasping like a landed fish. He lay beside the dead wolf, chest heaving, staring up at the canopy far above, unable to do anything but breathe. The second wolf, the one with the destroyed eye and broken nose, limped in a circle around the clearing, considering another attack. Blood dripped from its ruined face, leaving a trail in the mud, its breathing wet and labored. It growled, low and threatening, but there was uncertainty in the sound. This prey had already killed 2 of its pack, had fought with a ferocity that bordered on madness. This prey was dangerous in a way that no prey should be. Justin stared at it, too exhausted to even raise his hands in defense. Their eyes met across the clearing. Predator and prey, killer and killer. Something passed between them in that moment, some understanding that transcended species. The wolf could attack again, might even win, but it would be injured further, perhaps fatally. Was the meal worth the risk? Was revenge for its pack mates worth dying for? The wolf made its decision. It turned and limped away into the forest, leaving its pack mates behind, following the ancient law of survival that said living was more important than pride or revenge. Its retreat was neither cowardly nor honorable, simply practical. It would hunt again another day. Justin shoved the dead wolf off his chest completely and lay there gasping. Steam rose from his body, his overheated blood meeting the cold air and rain. His hands shook uncontrollably, adrenaline flooding his system with nowhere to go. This was not the first time he had killed on this planet. He had killed an overseer during his escape, bashing the alien's skull in with a rock while the guard slept. But it was the most brutal, the most savage, the most desperate. He had never been this close to death, never felt the jaws of the grave closing on him quite so literally. The rain continued to fall, washing some of the blood away, but not all of it. It never washed all of it away. Blood had a way of staining things permanently, soaking into skin and soul alike, leaving marks that no amount of water could cleanse. A small sound made him turn his head, the movement sending sparks of pain through his neck. Gloriali stood a few feet away, staring at him with those golden eyes now wide with a complex mixture of emotions: gratitude, fear, confusion, awe. She saw the blood covering his hands and arms, saw the savage way he had killed, saw the torn flesh and exposed muscle where the wolf had bitten him. She saw the brand on his shoulder visible through his torn shirt, the mark of a slave, her father's slave. She flinched, taking a step backward, her small body tensing as if expecting violence, expecting to be hurt. In her short life, slaves had always been kept at a distance, always controlled, always supervised. They were dangerous, her tutors had told her, animals that would hurt her if given the chance. She had never been alone with one, and this one had just killed 3 sacred beasts with his bare hands, had fought like a demon, had taken wounds that should have been fatal and kept fighting. Justin pushed himself to his feet, swaying dangerously. The world tilted and spun, vertigo washing over him in waves. He had to lock his knees to keep from falling, had to focus on a single point to keep his balance. Blood dripped from his torn forearm, steady drops that left a trail in the mud, each drop carrying away a bit more of his strength. He spat blood from his mouth, the taste of copper thick on his tongue, mixed with mud and rain, and wiped his face with the back of his hand, leaving muddy streaks across his features. He stumbled over to where his axe was still buried in the first wolf's skull. He grabbed the handle with both hands and pulled, grunting with effort, putting his foot on the wolf's head for leverage. The blade came loose with a sucking sound, bringing fragments of bone and brain matter with it, trailing strings of tissue. He wiped the blade on the dead wolf's fur, cleaning it as best he could, then turned to the girl. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other across the clearing, the man and the child, the slave and the master's daughter, the human and the alien. 2 beings who should have been natural enemies, who had every reason to fear and hate each other, connected now by violence and survival. Justin extended his hand toward her, palm up, fingers open, non-threatening. The gesture was universal, he hoped. "Come with me. Trust me. I will not hurt you." His hand shook with exhaustion, trembled with the aftermath of battle, but he held it steady through sheer willpower. She stared at the hand like it was a serpent coiled to strike. Her whole body trembled, torn between the terror of staying alone and the terror of going with this blood-soaked stranger. She looked back at the wolf corpses, at the clearing painted red and blue with mixed blood, at the evidence of violence that surrounded them. Then she looked at Justin's face, really looked at it, and saw something there that surprised her. His eyes were not the eyes of a beast. They were not empty or cruel or filled with hatred. They were exhausted and pain-filled and sad, infinitely sad, but also determined and somehow gentle despite everything. They were the eyes of someone who had made a choice and would see it through, no matter the cost. In the distance, a horn sounded. Closer now, much closer, the tone urgent and angry. The hunting party was closing in, following his trail, probably alerted by the sounds of combat. They would be here in minutes, perhaps less. Justin's patience, worn thin by pain and exhaustion, and 2 years of barely controlled fury, snapped. He did not have time for this gentle coaxing, did not have time to build trust slowly. He grabbed the girl by her upper arm, not roughly but firmly, and hoisted her onto his shoulder like a sack of grain. She was lighter than he expected, her people's hollow bones making them lighter despite their height. But even that small weight made his injured arm scream in protest. She started to protest, making high-pitched sounds of fear and confusion, her small fists beating against his back without much force. But Justin was already running, crashing through the undergrowth, ignoring the thorns that tore at his exposed skin, ignoring the branches that whipped across his face, ignoring everything except the need to put distance between them and the hunters. They burst from the clearing just as the first of the hunters arrived at the scene. A squad of 8 warriors riding creatures that were 6-legged and vaguely horse-like, covered in scales rather than hair, with eyes that could see in multiple spectrums. The riders wore armor made from treated animal hides, lacquered to a hard shine, decorated with the symbols of their rank. They carried weapons that gleamed even in the dim light, spears with leaf-shaped blades, swords that were slightly curved, bows made from laminated wood and sinew. The commander, the overseer himself named Caelthan in his own language, dismounted in one smooth motion that spoke of decades of practice. He was tall for his kind, nearly 7 feet, with skin so deep blue it was almost black, marked with the scars that warriors of his people wore as badges of honor. His face was aristocratic, with sharp cheekbones and a nose that could have been carved from stone. His jaw set in a line of absolute authority. He wore his power like a cloak, every movement precise and controlled, radiating the certainty of someone who had never been truly challenged. He saw the bodies of the wolves first. His expression did not change immediately, frozen in the commanding neutrality that leaders maintained. But his hands clenched into fists so tight the knuckles cracked audibly, a sound like small branches snapping. The blue wolves were sacred to his people, revered as the living embodiment of their god's fury, considered divine messengers that walked between the mortal realm and the spirit world. To kill one was blasphemy of the highest order, an offense that demanded public execution. To kill 3 was unthinkable, an affront to the gods themselves that would require the most severe punishment imaginable. His warriors had dismounted around him, staring at the scene with expressions of shock and disbelief. One of them, a younger warrior named Theron, knelt beside the largest wolf and touched its cooling body with reverent fingers. He looked up at his commander, his face pale despite his dark blue skin, and spoke in a hushed voice. The kill marks are crude, made with simple tools. The fighting was desperate, without skill or technique. He paused, examining the wounds more closely. This was not a warrior's work, my lord. This was survival. Caelthan said nothing, but his jaw tightened. He walked slowly around the clearing, taking in every detail with the trained eye of a military commander. The footprints in the mud, one set large and heavy, making deep impressions, clearly human. One set small and light, a child's prints. The pattern of the fight, readable in the disturbed mud and vegetation. The human had charged in without hesitation, without a plan, with nothing but fury and determination. Then he saw the piece of torn cloth in the mud, small and delicate, stained with blood. Blue blood. The specific shade and pattern of fabric that he recognized instantly because he had commissioned it himself for his daughter's 5th birthday celebration 3 months ago. His daughter's dress. The sound that came from Caelthan's throat was inhuman, something beyond rage, beyond anguish, beyond any single emotion. It was the sound of a father's worst nightmare made real, the sound of a man's soul being torn apart by the thought of his child dead or suffering or in the hands of a slave. It echoed through the forest, sending birds bursting from the trees in panicked flocks, making small animals flee in terror, making his own warriors take an involuntary step backward from the force of it. His mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. His daughter was dead, torn apart by wolves or killed by the slave. His daughter was dying, bleeding out somewhere in this wilderness. His daughter was being held hostage by a desperate man who would use her as a shield. His daughter was alive but traumatized beyond recovery by whatever had happened here. His voice, when he finally spoke, was cold and precise despite the fury beneath. Each word enunciated with perfect clarity, sharp as broken glass. He spoke in his own language, harsh and guttural, but the meaning was clear in the way he pointed into the forest, the way his hands trembled with suppressed violence, the way his warriors mounted their beasts with grim determination. Find the beast who did this. Find the slave who dared to touch my daughter. I want him alive if possible, so I can make his death last days. I want him to beg for mercy. I want him to curse the day he was born. I want his screams to be heard in every slave quarter as a warning. But if you cannot take him alive, bring me his corpse so I can desecrate it. Just bring me proof that he suffered, and bring me my daughter. Bring her home. The hunt was on with renewed fury. This was no longer just about recovering an escaped slave, no longer just about maintaining order and discipline. This was personal. This was about honor and revenge, and a father's protective rage given form and purpose. This was about showing every slave on this planet what happened when you touched what belonged to the ruling class. Justin ran through terrain that seemed specifically designed to kill him, created by a malevolent god who took pleasure in making survival as difficult as possible. The forest floor was a nightmare maze of hidden roots and loose stones waiting to turn an ankle. Vines hung low enough to clothesline the unwary, some of them covered in thorns that tore at exposed skin, others secreting toxins that burned on contact. The mud sucked at his feet like living things, trying to steal his boots with every step. Each extraction requiring precious energy he did not have to spare. And always, the rain continued to fall, making every surface slick and treacherous, filling his ears with white noise that made it hard to hear pursuit. Gloriali bounced on his shoulder, too terrified to even cry properly, just making small, gasping sounds that broke his concentration. She could hear the hunters behind them, their mounts crashing through the undergrowth with ease, where Justin had to fight for every yard. The six-legged beast could navigate this terrain at speeds that no human could match, could see in wavelengths that revealed tracks invisible to human eyes. It was only a matter of time before they caught up. Justin knew this. He had always known it from the moment he made the choice to save her. But knowing and accepting were different things. He changed direction suddenly, angling toward the sound of rushing water that he had been hearing in the background for the past hour. There was a river somewhere ahead, swollen by days of rain. Water meant a chance to lose the scent, to break the trail that the blue wolves would have been following if any remained. It also meant drowning, but that was a problem for future Justin to worry about. The forest opened up ahead, the trees thinning as they approached the riverbank. The transition was abrupt, going from dense jungle to rocky shore in the space of a few steps. The river itself was a raging monster, swollen by days of rain until it had burst its normal banks and was now a good 100 yards wide. It carried debris in its current, whole trees torn up by the roots, boulders tumbling along the bottom with sounds like distant thunder, foam and spray that turned the surface white with violence. The water was not blue like the wolf's fur or the native's skin. It was brown, thick with sediment, cold as winter, moving with the kind of power that could snap bones and pulp flesh without effort. Justin did not hesitate. He had learned that hesitation was death, that doubt was a luxury he could not afford. He waded in, gasping as the freezing water hit his legs, then his waist, then his chest. The cold was shocking, painful, driving the air from his lungs in an involuntary gasp. The water was so cold, it felt like being stabbed with thousands of tiny knives, each one finding a nerve ending and lighting it on fire. His injured arm screamed as the water touched the torn flesh, the cold making the pain even more intense. The current was immediately overwhelming, trying to tear his feet from the rocky bottom, trying to sweep him downstream to dash him against the boulders that he could see through the spray. Waiting like the teeth of some great beast, he lifted Gloriali higher, holding her above his head with both arms, ignoring the screaming pain in his injured forearm where the wolf had bitten him. The torn muscles protested, sending lightning bolts of agony up to his shoulder, threatening to make his grip fail. But he locked his elbows and refused to lower his arms, refused to let the pain win. She struggled in his grip, panic overriding reason, her small body thrashing with surprising strength. Her people feared deep water with an instinctive terror that went beyond mere caution. They had evolved in the mountains where water came in the form of thin streams and shallow pools, where drowning was not a threat that shaped their development. This river was a nightmare made real, every instinct in her body screaming to get away from it, screaming that she was going to die, that the water would swallow her and she would never breathe again. Justin gritted his teeth and pushed deeper, fighting the current with every step, each one harder than the last. The water reached his neck, then his chin, forcing him to tilt his head back at an uncomfortable angle. He tilted his head back to keep his mouth above the surface, taking quick, gasping breaths between waves that splashed over his face. His feet slipped on the smooth rocks below, polished by centuries of water flow, until they were as slick as ice. For a terrible moment, he thought they were going to be swept away, dashed against the boulders downstream that he could see waiting like teeth. His foot found purchase in a crevice between two rocks. He braced himself, feeling the rock edges cut into his foot even through his boot, and pushed forward with everything he had left. The opposite bank was only 20 feet away, but it might as well have been a mile. The current was so strong here in the middle that he could barely maintain his position, let alone move forward. Each step was a battle against the current, against his own failing strength, against the cold that was seeping into his bones and making his movements sluggish and uncoordinated. Halfway across, his foot slipped again, and this time he could not catch himself. The current grabbed him like a giant hand, pulling him under with irresistible force. Water filled his mouth, his nose bitter and choking and full of grit that scraped his throat raw. He tumbled, disoriented, unable to tell up from down, the world a spinning chaos of brown water and darkness. His lungs screamed for air. His body tumbled like clothes in a washing machine, hitting rocks and debris, each impact adding new bruises to his collection. But his arms, the arms holding Gloriali high above the surface, remained locked. Steel cables could not have been more rigid. If he died, if he drowned, his last act would be keeping her above water. That was the only thing that mattered. His own life was negotiable, hers was not. He surfaced, coughing violently, blind, operating on instinct alone. Forward, always forward. Never give up, never stop, never let her down. His knee struck a rock hard enough to make lights flash behind his eyes, hard enough that he felt something crack, bone or cartilage. He did not know which and did not care. His shin barked against something sharp, leaving a gash that immediately began bleeding into the water. Blood that was swept away by the current before he could even see it. He did not care, could not care. There was only the girl above his head and the bank somewhere ahead in the spray. His hand touched mud, solid ground, salvation. He crawled forward on his knees, more animal than man. Gloriali still held high, even though his arms were shaking so badly he thought they might simply fall off. He made it 2 yards up the bank, driven by willpower alone, before his strength gave out completely. He collapsed face first into the mud, unable to move, unable to do anything but breathe in great shuddering gasps that brought up water and blood. Gloriali scrambled off him, shivering violently, her lips tinged with purple from the cold, her whole body shaking like a leaf in a storm. She looked back across the river, her golden eyes wide with fear and amazement. On the far bank, the hunters had arrived, their timing perfect in the worst possible way. They sat on their mounts, watching with expressions that ranged from amazement to fury, to something that might have been respect. The river was too violent to cross, even for their powerful beasts. They would have to find another way, a bridge or a ford somewhere up or downstream. Kelton sat on his mount at the front of the group, staring across the water at the human who had stolen his daughter. Even at this distance, even through the spray and the rain that had started again, Justin could feel the weight of that stare, the promise of vengeance it carried, the absolute certainty that this was not over. The overseer raised his hand in a gesture that needed no translation, that was clear in every culture across every world. I will find you, I will catch you, and when I do, you will beg for death, and I will deny you until you have suffered beyond your ability to comprehend suffering. Justin knew this bought them time, but not much. An hour, maybe 2 at most before the hunters found a way across. He forced himself to his feet, swaying like a drunk, every muscle in his body screaming in protest, and grabbed Gloriali's hand. She pulled away, staring at him with confusion and fear written clearly across her young face, not understanding why he had saved her, not understanding what he wanted, not understanding anything except that she was cold and scared and wanted her father. He did not have the energy for gentleness or patience or understanding. He grabbed her again, firmer this time, but still careful not to hurt her, and pulled her into the forest on this side of the river. She followed, stumbling over roots and stones because she had no other choice. The human terrified her with his blood and violence and alien features. But the idea of being alone in this wilderness terrified her more. They walked for hours as the day slowly faded into evening, time measured only in steps and breaths and the slowly changing light. Justin's sense of direction was based on the sun, but the sun was invisible behind the perpetual cloud cover. He navigated by instinct, by the slope of the land, by the way water flowed downhill, by the moss that grew thicker on the northern sides of trees. He moved them gradually upward, into the hills, where the forest began to change around them. The massive trees of the lowlands gave way to smaller, more twisted specimens. The undergrowth became sparser, easier to navigate, but offering less cover. The air grew noticeably cooler with each step upward, and each breath came a little harder. They were climbing toward the dead forests, a region that the slaves in the mines had spoken of in hushed tones when the guards were not listening. A place where the soil was too poor and the air too thin to support the lush growth of the valleys. A place where few people ventured and fewer returned from. A place of death and desolation where even the planet itself seemed to have given up. Night fell gradually, the light fading in stages rather than all at once, the darkness never quite complete. Darkness was never complete on this world, one of the few mercies this planet offered. Bioluminescent fungi grew on many of the trees, casting a ghostly blue-green light that made everything look like it was underwater, that played tricks on depth perception and made shadows seem to move with lives of their own. The temperature dropped sharply with the absence of sunlight, the cold settling in like a living thing. Justin's wet clothes froze to his body, becoming stiff and uncomfortable, the fabric chafing against skin that was already raw from the day's ordeals. Gloriali's shivering became violent, uncontrollable, her whole body shaking so hard her teeth chattered audibly, a sound like castanets clicking in the darkness. They needed shelter immediately. They needed fire before hypothermia killed them. They needed food, though that was a luxury they would have to do without for now. The first two were achievable with effort. The third would have to wait until morning if they survived that long. Justin found a cave, though calling it a cave was generous. It was little more than a hollow beneath an overhanging rock face, maybe 6 feet deep and 4 feet high, barely large enough for both of them if they curled up. But it was dry, sheltered from the wind that had picked up with nightfall, and defensible if anything decided to attack during the night. That made it paradise. He sat Gloriali down in the back of the cave, as far from the entrance as possible, and went back outside to gather materials. Dead wood was scarce in this perpetually wet environment. Everything was damp or actively rotting, covered in moss and fungus. But he found dry moss growing in the hollow of a dead tree, protected from the rain by an overhang. He gathered handfuls of it, stuffing it into his pockets, along with some thin twigs that had been sheltered beneath a fallen log. His hands were so cold and numb that he could barely feel what he was touching, had to look to make sure he was actually gripping things. Back at the cave, he knelt in the entrance and began the laborious process of making fire. His hands shook from cold and exhaustion, making the work difficult and frustrating. He pulled out the piece of flint he had stolen from the mine, a fragment no bigger than his thumb that he had hidden in his boot for 2 months before escaping, insurance against a day exactly like this, and used it with his knife blade. He struck the flint against the steel, producing sparks. The first shower of sparks flew into the moss and died immediately, too weak to catch. The second shower died as well. The third, the fourth, the 10th. He cursed under his breath, words in English that Gloriali did not understand, but whose meaning was clear in his tone and expression, clear in the way his face contorted with frustration. His hands were shaking too much, his movements uncoordinated from hypothermia setting in, his fingers barely responding to his commands. He forced himself to slow down, to breathe, to focus. This was just another task, just another problem to solve. He had survived worse. He could survive this. Finally, on what must have been the 20th or 30th attempt, a spark caught in the heart of the moss bundle. A tiny red glow appeared, smaller than a match head, so faint he almost did not see it. But it was there. Hope. Life. Salvation. Justin leaned close, cupping his hands around it to shield it from any draft, and blew gently. Not too hard, or he would extinguish it like a birthday candle. Not too soft, or it would die on its own for lack of oxygen. Just right, feeding it air and oxygen, nursing the ember like a newborn child, like the most precious thing in the universe, because right now it was. The glow spread, slowly at first, then faster. Smoke began to rise, thin and acrid, making his eyes water. He added the finest twigs, pieces no thicker than threads, building the fire carefully and patiently, each piece placed with deliberate precision. A small flame flickered to life, orange and beautiful, and more welcome than anything he had seen in years. He added slightly larger twigs, building a structure that would allow air to flow, creating a pyramid that would burn efficiently. The flames grew stronger, crackling softly, casting dancing shadows on the cave walls. Gloriali watched with wide eyes, transfixed and uncomprehending. Her people used thermal stones for heat, rocks that naturally generated warmth when exposed to moisture, a property unique to this world's geology. She had never seen living flame before, had never witnessed combustion, had no framework for understanding what she was seeing. It danced and moved in ways that seemed impossible, seemed alive in a way that stones could never be. It was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure, casting shadows that flickered and jumped on the cave walls like living creatures. She reached toward it, fascinated, drawn by the warmth and light like a moth to a lamp. Justin's hand shot out with surprising speed considering his exhaustion, catching her wrist before her fingers could touch the flames. He held her hand firmly but not painfully, and shook his head with exaggerated slowness, making sure she understood. The gesture was clear. No, dangerous. Do not touch. This beauty will hurt you. She pulled back, startled by his speed and the firmness of his grip, her eyes going even wider. But she understood. The fire was not a toy. It could hurt. She would not touch it again. Justin built the fire larger, carefully adding progressively bigger pieces of wood as they dried from the heat, creating a careful balance between fuel and flame. He arranged the wood in a teepee structure that would burn for hours without tending. Soon the cave was filled with warmth and light, the temperature rising from freezing to merely cold to almost comfortable. The warmth was almost painful as it crept back into his frozen limbs, bringing with it a pins and needles sensation that made him grit his teeth. Gloriali stopped shivering gradually, her body relaxing as warmth seeped into her. Color returned to her lips, the purple tinge fading to a healthier blue. She moved closer to the fire, holding her small hands out to the warmth, and for the first time since Justin had found her in the clearing with the wolves, she relaxed slightly, some of the terror leaving her young face. Justin collapsed against the cave wall, his back against the stone, eyes half closed, riding the edge of consciousness. His body was reaching the end of its reserves, running on fumes and willpower and nothing else. The adrenaline that had kept him moving through the fight and the river crossing and the long walk was fading like smoke, leaving only pain and bone-deep exhaustion that went beyond the physical. Every injury made itself known now that he was still, and the adrenaline had worn off. The wolf bites on his arm throbbed with each heartbeat, the torn flesh swelling and turning angry colors, red and purple and black. The beginning of infection. His knee was swollen where he had struck the rock in the river, already the size of a grapefruit. His shin bled slowly through the torn fabric of his pants, leaving dark stains. His hands were covered in cuts and scrapes, some deep enough that he could see bone. His entire body was a map of pain, each injury a landmark in the geography of his suffering. But he was still alive, and so was she. That was enough. That was everything. His stomach cramped suddenly, violently, a sharp reminder that he had not eaten in 2 days. The rations they gave slaves in the mines were barely sufficient to keep a man working. Thin gruel made from local grains that tasted like cardboard, occasionally supplemented with scraps of meat so tough you could barely chew it, the occasional vegetable that was half rotten. Since his escape, he had eaten nothing but what he could scavenge, and there had been precious little time for scavenging while being hunted by professional trackers and their beasts. Gloriali's stomach made a similar sound, loud enough to echo in the small cave, a rumble that spoke of hunger beyond discomfort. She wrapped her arms around her middle, looking miserable, her face pinched with distress. She had probably never experienced real hunger in her privileged life. Every meal would have been prepared by servants, presented on fine dishes, varied and plentiful and wasted without thought. Now she was learning what it meant to be hungry, really hungry, the kind of hunger that gnaws at your insides and makes you weak, that makes you think about food constantly, that reduces you to your most basic animal nature. Justin forced himself to stand, his muscles protesting every movement, screaming at him to sit back down, to rest, to give up. He went back outside into the darkness, searching the immediate area by the light of the bioluminescent fungi. The blue-green glow was enough to see by, though it played tricks on depth perception and made everything look flat and strange, like a painting rather than a real place. He found a rotting log and used his knife to peel back the bark. The wood beneath was soft and crumbling, more fungus than tree at this point. Underneath, in the soft decaying wood, fat white larvae writhed in the exposed air. They were as long as his thumb and as thick as a finger, blind and helpless, their translucent skin showing dark organs inside, wriggling desperately to escape the sudden intrusion of light and air. They were disgusting, but they were protein. In his time in the mines, he had learned to eat worse. Rats that had died in the tunnels, insects that crawled through the sleeping quarters, fungus that grew on the walls and might or might not have been poisonous. He grabbed one, held it up to examine it in the dim light, then put it in his mouth before he could think too hard about it. The texture was horrifying, like biting into a water balloon filled with grease and paste. The larva burst between his teeth, releasing a flood of bitter liquid that coated his tongue and throat. The taste was earthy and foul, like licking mud mixed with old meat that had started to turn. His stomach tried to reject it immediately, heaving, his throat constricting, but he chewed and swallowed, forcing it down through sheer willpower and the knowledge that the alternative was starvation. He gathered several more, maybe a dozen, and brought them back to the cave in his cupped hands. They writhed against his palm, their movements tickling and disturbing. He held one out to Gloriali, offering it on his open palm like a treat. She looked at the squirming larva, looked at Justin's face still showing the strain of swallowing his own, looked back at the larva and recoiled. She shook her head violently, her face twisting in revulsion, backing away until her shoulders hit the cave wall, her hands raised as if to ward off evil. Justin did not argue, did not cajole or try to convince her with words he knew she could not understand. Words were useless here. He simply placed the larva in her small palm and closed her fingers around it, feeling how cold her hand still was despite the fire. His eyes met hers across the firelight, and in them she read a simple, unavoidable truth that needed no translation. Eat or die. Those are your only choices. Choose. She stared at the larva squirming in her closed fist, felt it wriggling against her palm, trying to escape. Tears began to roll down her blue cheeks, cutting tracks through the dirt on her face, leaving clean lines that showed how filthy she had become. She was crying not from fear of the larva itself, but from the humiliation of it, from the shattering of everything she had thought the world was. She was nobility, daughter of the overseer, raised in luxury and comfort and privilege. She had servants who anticipated her every need, cooks who prepared delicacies from across the planet, tutors who taught her the proper way to behave in every situation. The idea of eating insects, of putting something so disgusting in her mouth, was beyond degrading. It was a fundamental violation of who she thought she was, a destruction of her identity. But the alternative was starvation, slow, painful, inevitable death. And she was 5 years old and she wanted to live, even if living meant giving up everything she had been taught made her special. She looked at Justin one more time, seeing no sympathy in his expression, only determination and a kind of weary patience. He had eaten them without hesitation. He would survive. If she wanted to survive too, she had to do the same. There was no other way. She put the larva in her mouth, gagging before it even touched her tongue, her whole body rebelling against the action. The texture was even worse than she had imagined from watching it writhe, slimy and squirming, and still moving even inside her mouth. She chewed once, her face contorting in disgust, feeling the larva burst and release its foul contents. Twice, tears streaming down her face, and swallowed, the larva sliding down her throat like a slug. For a moment, it stayed down, her stomach accepting the foreign substance. Then her body rebelled completely, and she vomited, bile and larva splashing on the cave floor at her feet, the acidic smell filling the small space. Justin did not comfort her, did not pat her back or make soothing sounds or tell her it would be okay. He simply handed her another larva, his expression unchanged, his hand steady. This time she managed to keep it down, though her whole body shuddered with revulsion, though tears continued to stream down her face. By the third, she had stopped crying, her face going blank with shock or acceptance or simple numbness. By the fourth, she was just eating mechanically, her mind retreating to some distant place where this horror was not happening to her. This was the breaking of an aristocrat's pride. This was survival stripped to its most basic form, reduced to the simple equation of calories versus death. This was the wilderness teaching its lessons with brutal efficiency and no patience for delicate sensibilities. This was the moment when Gloriali stopped being a child of privilege and started becoming something else, something harder and more capable of survival. They ate in silence after that, Gloriali forcing down 6 of the larvae before she physically could not make herself eat another, before her throat refused to accept any more. Justin ate the rest, his face showing no emotion, just the grim necessity of fueling his body for whatever came next. When they were done, he wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and settled back against the wall, closing his eyes for just a moment. They slept that night on opposite sides of the fire. Justin with his back to the cave wall, one hand on his axe handle, the other on his knife. He had learned in the mines that you never slept completely, never fully relaxed, always kept a part of your mind alert for danger. Sleep was a luxury you stole in small increments, always ready to wake and fight at the first sign of trouble. Gloriali curled into a ball on the other side, using her torn dress as a blanket, pulling the fabric around herself though it provided little warmth. It was inadequate, but better than nothing. The fire provided most of the warmth, crackling softly, casting dancing shadows on the walls that looked almost alive. In the darkness beyond the firelight, things moved. Justin could hear them, rustling in the undergrowth, footsteps that were not quite right for any creature he knew, breathing that was too measured to be natural. Predators drawn by the smell of smoke and blood, investigating this unusual occurrence in their territory. But they did not enter the cave. Something about the human kept them at bay, some scent or sign that said danger, some instinct that whispered this prey was not worth the risk. Perhaps it was the scent of the dead wolves still on his clothes, marking him as a killer of sacred beasts. Perhaps it was something else, something primal that even the beasts of this alien world could sense through means beyond human understanding. This was a killer, wounded and exhausted, yes, but still a killer, still dangerous. Better to find easier prey elsewhere, prey that would not fight back with such desperation. Morning came slowly, the darkness fading to gray so gradually that it was hard to pinpoint the exact moment when night became day. The darkness took on a pale light that passed for day on this world, filtered through clouds that never seemed to break. The rain had stopped sometime during the night, leaving everything dripping and miserable, but no longer actively being pounded. The clouds remained, thick and oppressive, promising more rain soon, always promising more rain. Justin's arm had swollen significantly during the night, the wolf bites infected despite his best efforts to clean them in the river. The wounds were hot to the touch, radiating heat that spoke of infection taking hold, surrounded by red streaks that spread like the roots of some poisonous plant, branching out from the main wound site. The arm was stiff, difficult to move without sending jolts of pain through his entire body, throbbing with each heartbeat like it had its own pulse. He recognized the signs of blood poisoning, had seen it before in the mines when men got infected wounds and could not get treatment. He knew that if he did nothing, he would be dead in 2 or 3 days, maybe less if the infection was aggressive. The poison would spread to his blood, then to his organs, then his brain. He would become delirious, then unconscious, then simply cease to exist. He considered cauterizing the wound immediately, ending the infection before it could spread further. But he dismissed the idea after a moment of thought. Not yet. He needed full mobility for now, needed both hands working at full capacity. The hunters were still out there, still searching. When they reached safety, if they reached safety, he could deal with it. For now, he would have to push through the pain and hope the infection did not spread too fast. They ate more larvae for breakfast, the routine already becoming familiar in the way that survival necessities always do, normalized through repetition. Gloriali did not cry this time. She ate mechanically without pleasure or revulsion, just the acceptance of necessity, her face blank and distant. Her eyes had changed, Justin noticed. The soft innocence of childhood was hardening into something else, something that could survive this world, something that understood that survival sometimes required sacrificing who you were to preserve that you were. Justin watched her and saw the change happening in real time, saw the transformation that he had seen before in the mines. He had watched soft men transform into hard men or break completely under the pressure. There was no middle ground in places like this. You adapted or you died. You became something new or you ceased to be. She was adapting, changing, becoming someone who could endure what needed to be endured. They left the cave and continued upward, climbing steadily as the terrain grew steeper and rockier with each step. The forest was thinning with each yard of elevation they gained, the massive trees of the lowlands giving way to smaller and more twisted specimens that struggled to survive in the poor soil and thin air. They were entering the dead forests, a region that even the natives avoided, where the environment itself was hostile to life, where the planet showed its true indifference to the struggles of living things. For Justin, this was hell incarnate, a torture specifically designed for his physiology. His human lungs, evolved for Earth's richer atmosphere with its higher oxygen content, struggled with every breath. The air here was not just thin, it was different somehow. The mix of gases, subtly wrong for human physiology, each breath satisfying less than the last. His nose began to bleed, dark blood that dried in crusty trails on his upper lip and chin, making him look even more savage. Each step required conscious effort, forcing one foot in front of the other through pure willpower. His vision would occasionally gray out at the edges, forcing him to stop and lean against a tree until it cleared, gulping air that never seemed to satisfy, that left him just as starved for oxygen as before. Gloriali's people, by contrast, had evolved in these high altitudes over countless generations. Their lungs were larger in proportion to their body size. Their blood carried oxygen more efficiently with additional hemoglobin variants. Their muscles were adapted to extract every possible bit of energy from limited resources. For the first time since Justin had found her, she was the one with the advantage, the one who was comfortable while he suffered. She could breathe easily where he struggled, could walk without difficulty where he stumbled, could maintain her strength where his was failing. She watched him struggle, watched him stumble and catch himself on tree trunks, watched him wipe blood from his nose with the back of his hand, only to have more blood flow immediately. She saw his face turning gray, saw the way his movements were becoming slower and more uncoordinated, saw him starting to fail. And she made a decision that surprised herself, an act of kindness that went against everything she had been taught about slaves and their place in the world. She took his hand, her small blue fingers wrapping around his large scarred ones. The contact made him look down at her in surprise, confusion crossing his exhausted face. She did not speak. They shared no common language, could not explain themselves to each other, but she pulled gently but insistently, using her own body weight as an anchor, steadying him when he wobbled. They climbed together after that, the child leading the man, pulling him forward when his steps faltered, supporting him when he started to fall. She whispered to him in her own language, words of encouragement that he did not understand but whose meaning was clear in her tone, clear in the way she squeezed his hand reassuringly. She was giving back the strength he had given her, repaying the debt of protection with protection of her own kind, reversing the roles in a way that felt natural despite its strangeness. The roles had reversed in a fundamental way that neither of them fully understood. The protector had become the protected. The strong had become the weak. The adult had become dependent on the child, and somehow, impossibly, this made them stronger together than either could have been alone, created a bond that transcended the boundaries of species and social class. By midday, they reached a cleft in the rock face, a narrow crevice barely visible from the outside that opened into a small chamber inside. Justin practically fell inside, his legs giving out, unable to support his weight any longer. He sat against the back wall, breathing in harsh, wet gasps that ended in coughing fits. Each cough brought up dark phlegm, evidence of the damage the altitude was doing to his lungs, blood mixed with fluid and torn tissue. Gloriali gathered small sticks from outside, moving with purpose and determination, and tried to start a fire the way she had seen Justin do it. Her small hands could not generate enough force with the flint and steel, could not strike with the speed and strength necessary to produce good sparks. She tried and tried, her face set in concentration, her jaw clenched with determination, until Justin took the tools from her with gentle firmness and did it himself with practiced efficiency, his hands moving on autopilot even as his mind floated somewhere distant. The fire caught quickly this time, his movements more practiced than they had been the night before. Warmth filled the small space, taking the edge off the cold that permeated everything at this altitude. Justin closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the stone, marshaling his remaining strength for what had to be done next. He knew what was coming, had known since morning, had been delaying it because the thought filled him with a dread that bordered on terror. The infection in his arm had spread significantly overnight. The red streaks now reached past his elbow, dark lines under his skin, branching out like tributaries of a poisoned river. The arm was swollen to nearly twice its normal size, hot and tender, the flesh tight and shiny. The wolf bites themselves festered with yellow pus that smelled sweet and rotten at the same time, a smell that spoke of decay and death. If he did nothing, sepsis would set in within hours. He would become delirious, then unconscious, then dead. And Gloriali would be alone in this wilderness, with no one to protect her, no one to guide her, no one to teach her how to survive. That thought decided him, as he had known it would. He pulled out his knife and held it in the fire, watching as the blade slowly changed color with agonizing slowness. It went from silver to gold to orange to red, finally taking on the deep cherry red glow that meant it was hot enough to burn away infection and seal blood vessels and turn living tissue into charcoal. The process took several minutes. Minutes he spent breathing deeply, preparing himself mentally for what was coming, trying to build up reserves of courage and determination. Gloriali watched, not understanding at first what he was doing, her head tilted in curiosity. Then realization dawned in her eyes as she saw the heated blade and understood its purpose, and she started shaking her head violently, making small sounds of distress. She reached out toward him, trying to stop him, her small hands grabbing at his arm. But he caught her hand gently and held it, looking into her golden eyes, shaking his head slowly. This had to be done. There was no other way. She would understand someday. He looked around the cave for something to bite down on, something to muffle the screams he knew were coming. He found a piece of leather, a strap from his belt that had torn off during the river crossing. He folded it several times to make it thicker and jammed it between his teeth, biting down hard, feeling the leather compress. He looked at Gloriali one more time, his eyes apologizing in advance for what she was about to witness, for the trauma he was about to inflict on her young mind. Then he pressed the superheated metal against his infected wounds with deliberate force. The smell of burning flesh filled the cave instantly, overwhelming and nauseating, the stench of meat cooking combined with something chemical and wrong. The sound that came from Justin's throat was muffled by the leather, but still terrible. A mixture of scream and groan that spoke of agony beyond words, beyond description, beyond human capacity to endure. His back arched off the wall, every muscle in his body going rigid, tendons standing out like steel cables under the skin. The world went white with pain that consumed everything, then gray, then black around the edges. He could feel the metal sinking into his flesh, could smell his own body burning, could hear the sizzle of superheated steel meeting infected tissue like bacon on a griddle. The pain was so intense it transcended pain, became something else entirely, became a universe unto itself. He held the blade there for a count of 5, each second lasting forever, each one an eternity of suffering compressed into a moment. 5 seconds that felt like 5 hours. He had to make sure the heat reached deep enough to kill the infection, had to burn away all the poison tissue no matter how much it hurt. The infection had to die even if he died with it. Then he dropped the knife, the metal clattering on the stone floor, and slumped against the wall. His vision tunneled, darkness closing in from all sides like a collapsing cave. His last conscious thought was hoping he had done enough, hoping the cauterization had worked. He slumped sideways unconscious, Before he hit the ground, his face ashen, his breathing shallow and rapid. The leather fell from his mouth. His body was in shock, shutting down non-essential systems to deal with the trauma, conserving resources for survival. Gloriali scrambled to his side, terrified that he was dying, that this strange human who had saved her was going to leave her alone in this terrible place. She did not know what to do, had no medical training, had never been taught anything useful because her life had been one of luxury and leisure. But she did what she could with the instincts of a child trying to help. She blew on his wounds, trying to cool the burned flesh, her breath gentle and careful, her face close enough to smell the charred meat. She used a corner of her dress, already torn and ruined beyond repair, to wipe the sweat from his forehead that poured off him in rivers. She talked to him in her language, her voice small and scared and desperate, a constant stream of words that meant nothing to his unconscious mind but helped her feel less alone, less helpless. She begged him not to die, not to leave her alone in this terrible place. She promised she would be good, would be brave, would do whatever he needed if he would just wake up, just open his eyes one more time. Hours passed, the fire burned low, and Gloriali carefully fed it with more sticks, keeping it alive the way Justin had taught her, building it back up with patience and care. She stayed by his side the entire time, keeping watch, occasionally touching his face to make sure he was still warm, still breathing, still alive. She watched the rise and fall of his chest, counting the breaths to reassure herself. When he finally woke, it was to darkness broken only by the fire's glow and the feel of small hands holding one of his. His head felt like it was stuffed with wool, his thoughts slow and muddy and confused. For a moment he could not remember where he was or why his arm hurt so badly or who the blue child was. Then memory returned in a flood, bringing with it the pain that had been waiting patiently for his consciousness to return. He groaned, the sound involuntary, and Gloriali's face appeared above his, lit from below by the firelight in a way that made her look ghostly and unreal. She said something in her language, rapid and urgent and relieved, and he understood the tone if not the words. "You are awake. You came back. I was so scared. Thank you for not leaving me alone." Their eyes met across the dying flames, and something passed between them that neither could articulate. No words were exchanged because words were inadequate for what had happened here. The slave and the slave master's daughter, the human and the alien, the adult and the child. Those roles no longer seemed to matter, no longer seemed relevant to what they were building between them through shared suffering and survival. They were simply two beings, alone in a hostile world, surviving together because they could not survive apart, and that survival had created a bond stronger than language or species or social class, a connection forged in blood and pain and determination. Justin forced himself to sit up, ignoring the wave of dizziness that washed over him and made the cave spin. He looked at his arm through the haze of pain and exhaustion. The wounds were horrific, the flesh charred black around the wolf bites, the smell lingering despite the smoke from the fire. But the red streaks were no longer spreading, no longer creeping toward his heart with poisoned fingers. The cauterization had worked. The infection had been stopped, burned away along with a significant amount of healthy tissue. It would scar terribly. The arm would never work quite right again. He would probably lose some range of motion and strength, but he would live. For now, that was enough. He nodded to Gloriali, a small gesture of thanks for staying with him, for not abandoning him when he was vulnerable. She nodded back, understanding somehow that they had crossed some invisible threshold together. They were no longer just a slave and a child thrown together by circumstances. They were companions bound by choices made and prices paid. Partners in survival who depended on each other in ways that transcended the normal boundaries between people. The next 2 days were a blur of pain and movement and determination. Time measured only in the distance covered and the obstacles overcome. They climbed higher still, pushing into regions where even the dead forests gave way to bare rock and patches of ice that never melted. The temperature dropped below freezing every night, forcing them to huddle together for warmth despite the awkwardness of it. despite everything they had been taught about the proper distance between masters and slaves. The air became knife-thin, each breath barely satisfying, each movement requiring conscious effort. Justin's face was perpetually blue-tinged from hypoxia, his movements slow and clumsy as if moving through water, but he pushed on with grim determination, fueled by something beyond rational thought. They were putting distance between themselves and the hunters, buying time with altitude and suffering. The overseer's men were lowland warriors, not adapted for high-altitude combat, their bodies optimized for the thick air and moderate temperatures of the valleys. They would be suffering as much as Justin, perhaps more, struggling to breathe and move in this hostile environment. But they would not give up. Kael'thon would never give up. Not while his daughter was missing, not while the slave who had taken her still drew breath. The hunt would continue until one side could go no further. On the morning of the third day since the river crossing, they emerged onto a stone plateau that seemed to mark the end of the world. Before them, stretching into the distance like a wound in the planet itself, was a sight that made Justin's heart sink into his boots and filled him with despair. A chasm, vast and deep, its bottom lost in swirling mist that never cleared. The gap had to be at least 200 feet across, maybe more, the walls dropping sheer for what looked like thousands of feet. Far below, so far that sound could barely reach, was the crash of water as a river cut through stone. The only way across was a natural bridge of stone, narrow and treacherous, that spanned the gap in a gentle arch. The bridge was maybe 3 feet wide at its widest point, narrowing to perhaps 1.5 feet at the center, worn smooth by wind and rain and time. There were no railings, no safety measures, nothing to prevent a fall except balance and luck. But the bridge was not their immediate problem, not the threat that made Justin's breath catch. From the mist, from behind rocks, from every direction at once, warriors emerged like ghosts materializing from thin air. The overseer's elite guard, 24 of them, armed and armored, moving with the coordinated precision of a hunting pack that had practiced together for years. They had flanked ahead somehow, moving faster through terrain they knew better, using paths and shortcuts that only locals would know. They had cut off the escape route with military precision. Now the trap was closing with mechanical inevitability. They formed a semicircle, a killing ground, pushing Justin and Gloriali back toward the edge of the chasm with calculated movements. The only way out was over the bridge, but the bridge was blocked by warriors standing shoulder to shoulder, their weapons drawn and ready. They were caught between the army and the abyss, with nowhere to run and no hope of fighting their way through this many trained soldiers. Justin drew his stolen spear in one hand, his axe in the other, his weapons feeling heavier than they should. His body swayed, weak from altitude and infection and starvation and 3 days of constant flight. But his eyes were clear and hard and accepting. He knew this was the end, knew there was no escape from this situation, knew that he had run as far as he could run and fought as hard as he could fight. But he would not go down easily, would not surrender meekly, would not die without making them pay for every inch. He pushed Gloriali behind him with his hip, putting his body between her and the warriors, a human shield that would buy her maybe 30 seconds before they cut him down and took her back to her father. He stood there, weapons raised, ready to sell his life as dearly as possible, ready to die with whatever dignity a slave could claim. The warriors did not attack immediately, did not rush in for the kill. They were staring at him with expressions he could not quite read, expressions that seemed more complex than simple hatred or contempt. Amazement, perhaps. Respect, maybe. Something else that defied easy categorization. They were looking at this filthy, bleeding, barely standing human who had somehow killed 3 sacred wolves, crossed the Death River, survived the high peaks, and protected an alien child through all of it. There was something in those stares, something that went beyond simple hatred of a runaway slave, something that acknowledged what he had accomplished. This was not a slave standing before them. Slaves were broken, defeated, resigned to their fate, accepting of their place in the world. This was something else entirely. This was a warrior in all but name, standing ready to die with dignity rather than surrender, ready to fight to his last breath despite having no chance of victory. This was someone who had earned a measure of respect through actions rather than birth. The warriors parted like water before a ship's prow, and through their ranks walked the overseer. Kelton was magnificent in his full armor, every piece perfectly fitted and polished to a mirror shine, decorated with the symbols of his rank and lineage in precious metals and gemstones. His face was a mask of controlled fury, every line and plane of it speaking of barely restrained violence, eyes burning with the cold fire of a father's rage given 3 days to ferment into something harder and more focused. He saw his daughter behind the human slave, saw her torn and dirty but alive and apparently unharmed, and his mind drew the obvious conclusion based on everything he knew about the world. The slave was using her as a shield, as a hostage, as the only thing keeping him alive. The overseer raised his bow, a massive war bow that no human could have drawn, made from laminated horn and wood and sinew, a weapon that had been in his family for generations. He nocked an arrow with a barbed, explosive tip designed to punch through armor and detonate inside the target, turning organs to jelly and ensuring a quick death. His voice, when he spoke, was cold and clear despite the wind that whipped across the plateau. Each word enunciated with perfect clarity, sharp as broken glass and twice as dangerous. He spoke in his own language, but the meaning was clear from his tone and the way he gestured with his free hand, clear in the set of his shoulders and the fire in his eyes. Release her, and I will give you a quick death, the mercy of a warrior's end. Resist, and I will make you beg for death before I allow it to take you. I will peel your skin from your body in strips. I will break every bone in your limbs one by one. I will ensure that your last days are an agony beyond comprehension. He did not wait for a response, did not expect one, did not care what the slave might have to say. The bow creaked as he drew it to full extension, his muscles bunching with effort, the weapon groaning with stored energy. The arrow was aimed at Justin's chest, center mass, a shot that could not miss at this range. At 20 feet, even a child could have made this shot. The explosive tip would end this cleanly and quickly. Time seemed to stretch, to slow down in the way it does when death is imminent and the brain speeds up in a desperate attempt to find a way out. Justin could see the arrow in perfect detail, could count the spiral of feathers that stabilized it in flight, could see the slight wobble of the shaft as the overseer held the draw. He could hear Gloria Lee's breathing behind him, quick and panicked and terrified. He could feel the weight of his weapons in his hands, useless against an arrow moving at 200 feet per second, against physics and trajectory and inevitable death. He had always known it would end like this, in blood and violence on an alien world far from home. Ever since the abduction, ever since the first day in the mines when he had realized there would be no rescue, no miraculous escape, no salvation, he had known that this world would kill him. He had made peace with that death a long time ago, accepted it as the inevitable price of his circumstances, the only end that made sense. But not before saving her. That was the one thing that mattered now. If he died, let it be with meaning. Let it be for something other than ore and profit and the enrichment of masters. Let it be human, truly human, the kind of human that chose to act rather than accept. Let his last act be one of protection rather than submission. The bowstring sang its lethal song, a musical note that promised death, the sound of released tension and potential energy becoming kinetic. In that same instant, with the timing of perfect tragedy, Gloriale understood what her father was about to do. She saw the trajectory of the arrow plotted in her mind with childish certainty, saw where it was aimed with the clarity that sometimes comes to children who have not yet learned to doubt their perceptions, knew that in 1 second Justin would be dead, and she would be alone and safe, and she did not want to be safe at that price. She broke free from behind Justin, her small body moving faster than he could react in his exhausted state. She ran forward, small legs pumping with desperate speed, fueled by pure determination, and threw herself between the arrow and the human, with the fearlessness of a child who does not truly understand death. Her arms spread wide, her body a tiny shield utterly inadequate for the task, her face set in an expression of determination that looked far too old for her young features. "No!" she screamed in her language, her voice carrying across the stone with surprising force, amplified by the acoustics of the plateau. "Father, no! The overseer's eyes went wide, wider than they had ever been, white showing all around the golden irises. His hands moved on pure reflex, every instinct as a father overriding decades of training as a warrior. He jerked the bow upward with all his strength, fighting against the draw weight that wanted to complete its release. The arrow flew past Gloriali's head by inches, so close she felt the wind of its passage ruffle her hair, and struck the rock face behind them. It exploded on impact with a sound like thunder, showering the area with stone fragments that cut like shrapnel, embedding in flesh and drawing blood but causing no serious injury. Silence fell across the plateau like a physical thing, like a blanket thrown over the world. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. 24 warriors stood frozen, unable to process what they had just witnessed, unable to reconcile it with everything they knew about the world. The overseer's hands trembled, still holding the now empty bow, realizing with crystal clarity how close he had come to killing his own daughter. How one more fraction of a second, and she would be dead by his hand. Gloriali stood there in the space between the warriors and Justin, in the no man's land between two worlds, trembling from fear and adrenaline, but refusing to move, refusing to back down despite being tiny and helpless. She was tiny, ragged, covered in mud and blood and bruises that told the story of 3 days in hell. Her fine dress was torn beyond recognition, hanging in strips that barely covered her. Her hair was tangled with twigs and leaves and dried blood. But her voice when she spoke was clear and strong, carrying a conviction that belied her age and experience, carrying a truth that could not be denied. "He did not steal me," she said, her child's voice carrying across the stone with surprising force, words tumbling out in a rush, as if afraid she would lose her courage if she paused. "He saved me, Father. The wolves would have eaten me alive, would have torn me to pieces. You were sleeping in your warm house, comfortable and safe in your bed, while I was dying alone in the forest with no one to help me. This human fought them. He killed them to protect me when everyone else was too far away or too slow. He crossed the river holding me above the water, even though it almost killed him, even though he could have let me go and saved himself. He climbed the mountains when he could barely breathe because the air is wrong for his kind. He burned his own flesh to keep the poison from killing him because he knew I needed him. He never hurt me. He never asked for anything. He never stopped protecting me even when it would have been easier to leave me. He is not a beast. He is not property. He is my protector, and I will not let you harm him." The overseer stared at his daughter, unable to process what he was seeing or hearing, unable to reconcile this fierce creature with the soft child he knew. His entire worldview, built over decades and reinforced by culture and tradition and unquestioned belief, was built on the idea that humans were inferior, that they were animals to be used and discarded, creatures without the spark of true intelligence or nobility. They were useful tools, nothing more. Their suffering meaningless because they were not truly alive in the way that mattered. But here was his daughter, his precious child who had been raised in luxury and taught these same beliefs from birth, defending one of them. Defending him with the kind of courage and loyalty that he had only seen in his finest warriors, in soldiers who had earned their honor through years of service and countless battles. She was standing between her father and a slave, choosing the slave, risking everything for him. He looked past her to the human. Justin stood there, weapons in hand, ready to fight to the death despite having no chance of winning, despite knowing that he would die within seconds. There was no pleading in his eyes, no begging for mercy, no attempt to use the child as leverage or to manipulate the situation. Just a grim acceptance and an unspoken promise written clearly in his stance, readable in every line of his exhausted body. "If you want her, you will have to go through me first, and I will make you pay for every inch, and I will die knowing I did everything I could." The overseer had fought in 3 wars across 2 decades. He had led armies against rival clans in battles that became legend. He had commanded warriors in conflicts that would be studied for generations. He had seen courage in many forms, had witnessed acts of bravery that inspired songs and stories. He knew what it looked like when someone chose death over dishonor, knew what it meant to stand firm in the face of overwhelming odds, and he recognized it now in this broken, bleeding slave who would die before abandoning a child that was not even his species, not even his responsibility, not even someone he should care about according to the laws of nature and society. This human had chosen to act when inaction would have been safer and easier, had chosen to protect when he could have walked away, had chosen to become what his captors insisted he could never be. It shattered something fundamental in Kaelton's worldview, some certainty that had guided his life for 40 years, some belief about the natural order of things, some comfortable assumption about the inferiority of others. If humans were animals, why had this one shown more honor than most warriors he knew? If they were inferior, why had this one accomplished what seemed impossible? If they lacked nobility and conscience, why did this one stand ready to die with such dignity? The questions had no easy answers, and that alone was revolutionary. That alone changed everything. He lowered his bow slowly, the motion deliberate and symbolic, each inch of movement carrying weight. He spoke a single word in his language, a command that carried the force of absolute authority. His warriors looked at each other, confused and uncertain, their training telling them one thing, but their commander ordering another. They had been ready for battle, ready to kill this slave and recover the overseer's daughter and restore order. But now their commander was ordering them to stand down, to let the human live, to allow the impossible. They obeyed anyway because they were warriors and discipline was absolute, because their commander had earned the right to make such choices. They stepped back, opening a path toward the bridge, creating a corridor of armed bodies through which Justin could walk if he dared to trust this unexpected mercy. The overseer looked at his daughter one last time, really seeing her for the first time since this had begun. She was changed utterly, transformed by 3 days of hardship into something he barely recognized. The soft, sheltered child who cried when her toys broke was gone forever, replaced by someone harder, someone who had looked into the face of death and survived, someone who understood that the world was not divided simply into masters and slaves, but into those who chose courage and those who chose cowardice. Then he looked at Justin, their eyes meeting across the space between worlds. Understanding passed between them without words, the kind of understanding that transcends language and culture, the recognition of one warrior by another. This was not forgiveness. This was not friendship. This was not even acceptance. This was simply the payment of a debt, the settling of accounts in the only currency that mattered. You saved my daughter's life when you could have saved only yourself. I will let you keep your life in return. The debt is paid. We are even. The message was clear in the overseer's expression, in the set of his shoulders, in the way he stepped aside and gestured toward the bridge. Go. Take your freedom while it is offered. Disappear into the wild lands beyond the bridge where no one goes. Never return to the settled lands. If our paths cross again, this debt will be settled, and I will kill you without hesitation, will hunt you down and show no mercy. But for now, for this moment, you may go. Justin understood perfectly. He backed toward the bridge, never taking his eyes off the warriors who could attack at any moment if they chose, never lowering his weapons until he reached the stone arch that spanned the abyss. Gloriali tried to follow him, her small feet moving automatically toward the human who had protected her, not wanting to leave the one who had kept her safe. But he stopped her with a look and a gentle shake of his head, his expression sad but firm. No. You stay. This is where you belong. Your place is with your people, not with me. She ran to her father, who caught her in his arms with desperate strength, holding her with the desperation of someone who had thought they had lost everything, who had been given a second chance at what mattered most. But her eyes never left Justin, tracking him as he stepped onto the bridge, golden eyes wide and wet with tears that flowed freely down her blue cheeks. She had been changed by these days in a way that would never fully fade, altered at a fundamental level that would affect every choice she made for the rest of her life. The soft, sheltered child was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that strength came in many forms, that courage did not depend on species or status or the circumstances of birth, that sometimes the greatest nobility came from the most unexpected places. Justin reached the midpoint of the bridge, the most dangerous point. It was terrifyingly narrow here, barely 2 feet wide, and the wind was strong enough to make him stagger, to make each step a calculated risk. One misstep meant death, meant falling into the abyss and tumbling for thousands of feet before hitting the water below with enough force to break every bone in his body. He paused for just a moment and looked back one final time. Gloriali raised her hand in farewell, fingers spread in a gesture of goodbye and gratitude and promise. Justin raised his in return, the gesture simple and profound, weighted with everything that had passed between them. Then he turned and walked into the mist that swirled on the far side of the bridge, walked into the unknown with steady steps despite his exhaustion. Within seconds, he was just a shadow in the white. Within a minute, he was gone completely, swallowed by the wilderness that stretched beyond the known lands. Gloriali watched until there was nothing left to see, staring into the mist long after even the sound of his footsteps had faded into silence, her hand still raised as if he might turn back and see it. The warriors began to murmur among themselves, discussing what they had witnessed in low voices, already beginning to shape the story that would spread through the cities and become legend. The slave who killed the sacred wolves, the human who crossed the death river, the beast who showed more honor than most civilized beings. The overseer remained silent, holding his daughter, lost in thoughts he could not yet articulate but that would haunt him for the rest of his life. His world had been shaken to its foundations today, and he knew instinctively that nothing would ever be quite the same, that this moment would be a turning point whose full significance would only become clear with time. Gloriali buried her face in her father's chest, but inside something had changed permanently and irrevocably. The man who had saved her, the human slave who had fought wolves and crossed rivers and climbed mountains while carrying her to safety, had shown her what true strength looked like. It was not armor or weapons or social rank or the circumstances of birth. It was the willingness to sacrifice everything for someone who could give you nothing in return. It was choosing to act when inaction would be easier and safer. It was being human in the deepest sense of that word, in a way that transcended species. She would never forget him, would carry this memory with her for the rest of her life. Years later, when she had grown into a warrior herself feared across 3 kingdoms, when she commanded her own forces and fought in the wars that would eventually reshape her world, when she advocated for reforms that would slowly and painfully end slavery among her people, she would tell this story. She would tell it in hushed tones around campfires to warriors who had earned the right to hear it, and those warriors would listen in respectful silence because they understood that some lessons can only be learned in the wilderness, at the edge of death, with nothing but courage to keep you warm. But all of that was in the future, distant and unknown, merely potential waiting to be realized. For now, she was just a child, crying into her father's embrace, while somewhere in the mist, a human walked alone into freedom, wounded and exhausted but alive, still alive against all odds. The wind carried the sound of his footsteps for a moment longer. Then even that was gone, leaving only silence and memory and the beginning of change. Far below in the lowlands, in the mines where Justin had once been a slave, the other human prisoners would hear the story within days, carried by guards and traders and travelers. How one of their own had killed the sacred wolves that everyone feared. How he had defied the overseer himself and lived to tell about it. How he had walked away free into the wild lands while warriors watched and did nothing to stop him. The story would spread through the slave quarters in whispers, told carefully when the guards were not listening, growing with each telling as stories do. They would not believe it at first because it was too impossible, too much like a fantasy told to children. Humans did not defy masters and live. Humans did not win. Humans died in chains or in the mines or at the end of whips. But some of the guards would confirm it, speaking in reluctant admiration tinged with confusion and uncertainty. And the story would grow in the telling, as stories always do, until it became something larger than the facts. It would become a symbol of possibility, proof that they were not just animals, not just property to be bought and sold, but beings capable of great things when necessity demanded it. In a few months, the first rebellion would begin in the northern mines where conditions were worst. It would be poorly planned and quickly crushed, and many would die. But it would plant seeds. Those seeds would grow into movements. Those movements would grow into change, slow and painful, and bought with blood and sacrifice. but real nonetheless. And at the heart of it all would be the tale of one man who had shown, through nothing more than determination and courage, and the refusal to accept the unacceptable, that a human being was worth something on this alien world. But Justin knew none of this as he walked north into lands that no one had mapped, into territories that appeared on no chart. He only knew that he was walking into wilderness without end, injured and alone, with few supplies and no clear destination. By all rights, he should lie down and die. The infection in his arm was only temporarily held at bay and could return at any time. The altitude was slowly killing him with every breath. He had no food and no reliable way to find it. The temperature at night could freeze him solid. Any number of predators could track him and attack. He was leaving behind the only company he had known in 3 days, the only person on this world who had shown him kindness. Instead, he kept walking, one foot in front of the other, because that was what you did when giving up was not an option. You kept moving, you kept fighting, you kept surviving until you could not anymore. And then you pushed beyond that point because the alternative was unacceptable, because surrender meant death not just of the body, but of something more important. Behind him, the bridge stood empty, a threshold between two worlds, between slavery and freedom, between his past and his unknown future. Before him stretched wilderness without end, full of terrors he could not imagine and challenges he was not prepared for. But for the first time since his abduction, for the first time in 2 years of slavery and suffering and watching himself slowly die inside, Justin was free in a way that transcended mere physical liberty. And that was enough. That was everything. That made the suffering worthwhile. He thought of Anna one last time as the mist closed around him, wondering if she was looking at the same stars from Earth that he would see tonight when the clouds cleared. Probably not. These stars were not his stars, formed different constellations that told different stories. This sky was not his sky, containing moons and colors that Earth had never seen. This world was not his world and never would be. He would never see home again, would never hold his daughter again, would never go back to his old life with its comfortable routines and minor annoyances that seemed so precious now in retrospect. But he had saved a life today. A child lived because he had chosen courage over safety, sacrifice over self-preservation, action over acceptance. And maybe in the end, that was what mattered more than anything else. Not where you died or how you died, but what you stood for when death came calling. Not the years you lived, but the moments that defined those years and gave them meaning. The mist closed around him like a curtain, thick and cold and concealing, and Justin disappeared into legend.